So as we talked about in class on Monday, this past week marked the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which led to the eventual reunification of Germany. And so this moment is one of the most memorable events of modern European history. And much like the discussion following Germany's role in World War II, there remains a debate surrounding the memory of the GDR and how its legacy should be known. So today I'm going to argue that the memory of the GDR has largely been ignored by most East Germans, and if it is to be remembered at all, it should be remembered in a negative light for its harsh oppression of its citizens. So my three main points are that following reunification, East Germans not only embraced Western culture, but also disregarded their former identity. The GDR was and still is remembered by most East Germans as a heavily oppressive and unjust state, and any positive memories of the GDR are largely overshadowed by the negative memory of the Stasi. So when the Berlin Wall fell, most East Germans were eager to enter the West and discover a new culture. And once they were exposed to this new system of capitalism, they fully embraced this new culture and abandoned their previous identity. So one of the articles we read for today was by James McAdams, and he writes, "Capitalism and the freedoms that went along with it quickly proved to be irresistible. Once the tangible benefits of life in West Germany were to be confirmed, there was no longer any point to preserving the GDR." And so this sentiment that he's discussing is also reiterated in the movie Goodbye Lenin. So Goodbye Lenin is a 2004 German film, and it's about a young man named Alex who's living with his sister and his mother in East Germany right before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So in the beginning of the movie, his mother has a heart attack and she goes into a coma, and so while she's in a coma, all these events occur. So the Berlin Wall falls, Germany is reunified, and then the GDR ceases to exist. And so once she comes out of her coma, Alex and his sister comedically have to try to prevent her from figuring out that anything has changed, because they think that if she realizes that the country she once knew and loved no longer exists, she would probably have another heart attack. And so there's a scene in the movie where Alex is going to buy old clothes that people would have worn when they lived in the GDR. And his sister's looking through them, and she says, "Look at the crap we used to wear." And I think this is an interesting scene because this crappy clothing that she's talking about is something she would have worn only a few months prior. And I think that really shows how quickly East Germans were willing to embrace Western capitalism. And then throughout the movie, you have images of different American industries and the emergence of capitalism. So banners that once displayed the GDR now show Coca-Cola and things like that. And when Germany was finally reunified, East Germans not only embraced a new culture, but they forgot their past. And so one of the things that McAdams also talks about in his article is the role of Alex in the film. So he says, on a deeper level, the story is really about Alex, who along with everyone else around him has lost no time in shedding his East German identity. So he points to several instances in the movie where Alex seems to embrace Western music, new heavy metal music, Western art. He starts doing drugs that wouldn't have been available to him in the GDR. And so this is another scene from the movie where you really see how enthusiastic East Germans were about this new reunification. And he says, "The winds of change blew on the ruins of our republic. Summer came and Berlin was the most beautiful place on earth. We are at the center of the earth where things were finally happening, and we went with the flow. The future was in our hands, uncertain and promising." And so this desire for change is also clearly seen in voting behavior and migration patterns that McAdams also touches upon. So he mentions that in 2009, only 2 East German politicians were in the Chancellor's cabinet. And I think this is a very interesting point, because if East Germans were expected to have this nostalgia for the GDR, you'd think that they would try to elect more East Germans to the government, but clearly this shows that they don't really seem to care for having more East German representation. And so we also see the lack of the GDR's legacy in the migration patterns. So from 1990 to 2008, the East German population dropped from 18.2 million to 16.6 million. And McAdams also says that it's predicted that another 1 million East Germans will have left East Germany between 2008 and 2020. And so this large migration of people out of East Germany doesn't really indicate any sort of longing or nostalgia for the GDR. And so the oppressive nature of the GDR most clearly explains why East Germans were so quick to embrace the West. And Jutt also talks about this when he says, "Rather than engage the GDR's troubled history, in other words, its former subjects were encouraged to forget it." And so you really see the harsh oppression of the Stasi and the GDR in the film The Lives of Others, which we watched last week. And I think a really interesting scene from this film is, if you remember, there's Draven, he's the writer, and his girlfriend Krista is the actress. And so she starts this relationship with the Minister of Culture in order to advance her career. And so there's this one scene where she's basically trying to explain to Draven why she has to do it. And she says, I need this whole system, what about you? Then you need it too. And why do you do it? Because they can destroy you too, despite your talent and your faith. Because they decide what we play, who is to act, and who can direct. And this oppression of the GDR, I think, is also exemplified in the opening scenes of Goodbye Lenin, which the picture on the right is depicting. So that's the main character, Alex. And in the beginning of the film, he's engaged in this peaceful protest. And so the police end up detaining him, basically beat him up essentially, and then they throw him into prison. And so any virtuous qualities of the East German state are hard to recognize when you consider the gross injustice that was suffered by so many when they lived under the GDR. And this kind of, I think, overshadows any positive outlook that one could have for East Germany. And so one of the counter-arguments to this critical view of the GDR is the claim that within the GDR, there were certain positive elements that instilled virtuous values and traditions that should be positively remembered and celebrated. But this nostalgia for the GDR, while it certainly did exist among East Germans following the reunification of Germany, this nostalgia was largely superficial, and this nostalgia clearly wasn't strong enough to dissuade people from embracing Western capitalism. And so McAdams touches upon this when he says, I do not mean to suggest that the ordinary East German's feelings of attachment to his country were shallow or insincere. But when we consider how quickly the GDR fell apart after the opening of its borders, these feelings were unambiguously not deep enough. And so this feeling of nostalgia also cannot explain why people embraced Western culture and why so many people left the East immediately after the Berlin Wall fell. So McAdams makes it clear that those who were able to leave the East did leave the East, and, quote, those who stayed behind in the East do so not because of affection, but because they had no other choice. And so, just to wrap up my main points, memory of the GDR should not be positively celebrated. If it is to be remembered at all, it should be remembered for its harsh repression. And despite any affection people might have had for the GDR, most East Germans found no trouble in embracing Western culture and abandoning East German identity. And so when people lived for so long under the oppression of the GDR and the Stasi, it's hard to remember East Germany in any sort of positive light, especially when the appeal of Western capitalism was right around the corner.